Hi guys, in the last video we made this procedural material inside Blender. If you want to know how to make it, I'll put a link in the description for the previous video that I made. In this one I'm going to teach you guys how to animate this, and this is quite easy to do if we work with our timeline down here and a graph editor. So first thing I'm going to do is right click on this horizontal divide on the bottom and click horizontal split and split my timeline into two. On the bottom, I'm going to choose, click this menu drop down here and choose the workspace for graph editor, and then we can work with both the graph editor and the timeline. The first thing that we could animate with this is the actual object itself, which I'll talk about first. So if with the object selected on this side of the screen, I'm going to press N on the keyboard to make this menu pop out. So N controls this menu. And we can rotate this object on the Z axis. If I just enter a value in this, my object is going to spin. This can be very easily keyframed. So for it to animate, so if I press I with my mouse over this over this value here, if I press I for insert and the keyframe gets inserted, you'll see here a little yellow diamond appears at frame 1 because we're starting at frame 1. So this is my timeline. I'm going from frame 1 to 250. And let's say I want to rotate this around 60 frames. I can move my timeline down to 60 frames. And in the Z rotation, I can type in here 360 for 360-degree rotation and press I here to insert. And if I go back now, you can see between these keyframes, there is this rotation happening. What's good to do at this point is to actually work with just the frames that we're looking at. So my timeline now goes from 1 to 250. And really, we just want this to go from 1 to 60 because we're working with 60 frames. So I'm going to set this end number here to 60. And if I scroll in on my mouse to like zoom, I can reset this from 0 to 60 across the timeline in the bottom. I can do that down here as well with the graph editor because right now I don't really see much of the graph. With this, if you middle click your mouse in this space, you can kind of grab and drag this area around. Again, I'm going to zoom in on this and just drag this down to go from about 0 to 60. Either side, right. The first thing to notice, if you were to watch this back, it starts out quite slow, it speeds up, and then it goes slow again. It's not a constant speed. Like when this is spinning around, it's not spinning at one consistent speed. And that's because of the interpolation between these two frames. That is visible in this graph here. If I zoom all the way out and we look from one side to the other. Okay, I'm just gonna zoom out on this graph just to show you guys what we're looking at here. So on the side of this graph editor here, on the left side, you can drop down this menu here called Cube Action and look at the object transform. And this will show you the rotations that are being affected by these keyframes here. So we have these three boxes are reflected by these three graphs here. If I choose the Z one, we see this blue axis, this blue graph line up here. And right in the beginning, you see from frame 0, to 7, this is like a smooth transition. This is like a curved movement. And if I go all the way to the top of this graph, all the way up to 360, again, we see like a curved end to this. So that means that as this plays, there's a slow start, a slow end, and a quick middle section. Sometimes you want this, sometimes you want a nice smooth interpolation between two keyframes, but for this we actually want these to be quite direct so that the spin just keeps happening. So if I highlight both of these keyframes in the timeline and I right click and choose under interpolation mode, I set this to linear. This line has now gone straight at the end and it will be the same at the bottom. This is no longer curved, it's gone straight. And if I play this, the rotation of this object is consistent. It's not speeding up and slowing down, it's just going from one to the next. That's just a quick explanation of how the interpolation modes work. but we're not going to spend too much time with that today. But if you want this to rotate, that is a good thing to know, to have a consistently timed rotation. What we're more interested in today is the uh, animation of the actual material. So first thing we're going to do is on the side here, there's a little tiny arrow on your timeline. This little arrow will drop this menu out the side, and you can drop this summary open, and then under cube, well, it's now a sphere, but this was originally the cube. We can look under here and see all of our transforms and things that have keyframes applied to them. So for example, this one has a rotation applied, a rotation value applied, but we want to look at this in terms of material. So this will let us edit all of our materials, our material keyframes, in fact. So things that we might want to keyframe could be, for example, if we zoom in on the noise texture here, we have a scale. So if I go to frame 1 and I set the scale to 8 and I want to insert a keyframe at 8.7, I just press I again for insert and my box goes yellow. And now I should have, if I click on this node here, I see this material option now. And then under here, I see my material keyframe. So I've inserted one keyframe at the beginning, 8.7. And if I go to the end, I could change this scale. I could move this down, for example. And then orange means that we don't have a keyframe inserted, but we've changed the value. So if I press I here again, I've inserted a keyframe after. And I can see this from the timeline in the bottom. And now if I scroll this timeline, I'm going to rotate my cube and my texture scale is going to change as well. I could insert keyframes in the middle of this as well to change the scale. But you can do this to change the location. If I wanted to rotate scale, keyframe these values here, I could change the rotation, for example. So I'll insert one here, go to frame 30, change the rotation, insert one here, go to frame 60, change it back, let's say, and then insert another keyframe. So now I have a lot of movement happening as this is spinning around. It becomes quite dynamic, and there's a lot of things that you can, I guess, do with this. What becomes interesting though is if we look at the detail and roughness option, if in the beginning we turn the detail really far down, for example, we could start this off as like a liquidy blob thing. So I'm going to insert a keyframe there. And then right at the end, I'm going to increase the detail all the way back to where it was before, about 8.7, I think it was. So insert keyframe there. And now when I scroll through this, my material is going to kind of appear. I think I'm going to delete this rotation one. So here I have the rotation keyframe. And to delete them, you can just click the keyframes, or you can do it in the graph editor as well. So here I've gone under object transforms to the Z rotation, and I can just click that keyframe and delete it, and delete the end one as well. And now my material is just moving with itself and not rotating anymore. So that's a very quick overview of how this can all animate the surface. We can also do this with the colors as well. So if I go to my color ramp in the top here, I have this blue, purple, and different blue value. And for example, if I click this slider here, I press I to insert a keyframe in the beginning, this box has now gone yellow around the edge. If at frame 30, I change this color to pink, insert a keyframe here, and then at the end, change this to green, for example, and insert one there. This color will now change as the timeline moves down. So you can do this for all the colors. So insert one here, change this one, and see how this will affect the look of the materials that we've created. So press I to insert the keyframes, and then you can just scroll through this and everything is going to change and move and transition at the same time. So any value, anything in here can really be keyframed. All of these values here, your color ramps can be, your locations can be, your bump strength can be, the displacement, everything. So use that, I guess, wisely to create what you want. and then I'll show you guys now how to set up some renders from this. So in order to get into the rendering, I think I'm going to need to set up a camera. And I've got one in my scene already. If I click this camera view here, I will pop into my camera view. If I click out of it, I'm going to jump in and out of the camera view. A nice shortcut you can use if you set up the viewport as you want it. So if maybe I want to look at it from this angle, and I press Control and Alt on the keyboard and then the 0 key on the number pad, my camera's going to snap to my view that I've got there. As you see, it's quite zoomed in, so I'm going to press N on the keyboard to make this menu come out. I'm going to click on View, and then here, I'm going to click Camera to View. And now that will lock this camera. If I press N again to shut this menu, it will lock the camera to this view position, and I can just zoom, and frame this up a bit. I think I want this render to be square, so I'm going to go to my output settings on the side and turn this resolution to 1024 by 1024 for a 1K render. And then I can zoom in a little more on my object. So now I framed this up. I think this is in a good spot. I'm going to press N again on the keyboard and turn off camera to view. And now if I zoom in a bit, I can just really zoom my frame into the viewport, and this is going to be my render frame. I'm going to close this menu out, and now this is where my render is going to be set from. What we can do is with the camera selected up here, choose the camera icon down in the bottom on the side for the object data properties on the bottom, and turn on depth of field. And initially this is going to blur out a little bit, but you can set this by distance. So if I just change this distance a bit, we can probably sharpen this image up. But a nice way to control this is actually with an empty. So I'm just going to turn this shader viewport for a second into the 3D viewport and just look at what we've got set up. So this is my sphere. This is my camera pointing at it. And if I press Shift and A on the keyboard and I search for an empty and I add a sphere, I can press S to scale this down quite small and G to just move this around. So if I grab this and I set it on the surface of my sphere, just in front of the camera at a certain point, and then going back to my camera properties, so I'm going to select my camera, go to the camera properties here, and under focus object, choose empty. This empty will now be in control of where my focus is going to go. So if I move this close to the camera, it's going to blur out. If I move it right onto the surface, it's going to focus directly onto that point. So I'm going to set that like this, and that gives us a nice depth of field. We can intensify that if we want with this value here. The lower you go, the more blur you get in the background. The higher you go, the less blur you get in the background. So if I set this to 1.5, we get quite a blurred out effect, and we're really looking in at this material right now. So the camera's set up, we've added the depth of field control, and now we can look at the render settings. The main thing here is if we go to the back, click the one that looks like the back of a camera right at the top. This is our render settings, and we have viewport and render. And you see that viewport is set to 0.1 on the noise threshold. Render is set to 0.01 on the noise threshold. So the render is running 10 times more in the noise threshold than the viewport is. Again, for the samples, this one's set to 4096 and this one's set to 1024. So this is running four times as many samples as in the viewport. If I press F12 on the keyboard and just render this out, we'll see very quickly how this long one frame is going to take. And it says remaining is about 2 minutes to render this out to 4,000 samples. And that's running here. I can see the sample count coming, and this isn't looking too bad, so I don't think I need 4,000 samples. I'm just going to close this render out and then drop this down to maybe 512 and then press F12. And then this should render relatively quickly now. So this render time is about 10 seconds we're getting here, I think, 8. And that's going to run good enough. But what I wanted to explain quickly is, as well as these settings here, if you scroll down and look under light paths, these settings as well are going to affect our total render time in this scene as well. So right now I've got some values input into here and transmission is actually set quite high and I'm not using any transmission in this image. So I'm going to set this to a 4, let's say. And this might render quicker now. But the point is, if I show you in a separate scene, just to explain this, here I have two materials, a glass material and a transparent material. So this one has an alpha. I'm using a noise to create a transparency mask here. This is all in cycles, and then this is a glass material. One thing to note with this glass material, I've got a solidify modifier applied to this to make it react more like glass. If I turn this off, you see the reflection changes, and that's due to the thickness of the glass. So this now has a thickness of about 2 millimeters, and I can increase that thickness here, and you see that this glass starts to look thick. I'll just drop that back down. But the point being, when you're rendering glass and opacity, there's settings to look at to get the best result. And with glass, this is very easy to set up. This is just using transmission. So if I turn transmission all the way off, my object is white. If I turn transmission all the way on, my object looks like glass. And that is how we very quickly set up a glass shader. The index of refraction, the IOR, on glass is about 1.5. And if you change this value, you see how the glass will start to react differently to light. So I'll again set this to 1.5 and quickly explain under the render settings here, under light paths on the side. So click the camera one for the render settings, scroll down to light paths. And if under transparent, I enter 1, you see my transparent shader is really not working anymore because it doesn't have enough light bounces to be transparent enough. So if you render something like hair or something like lace with a really fine amount of transparency, to get the best result, you might need to enter 6 into here or above. If I enter 8, maybe it's 6 is the limit for something like this. But again, if you have really fine detail in this, you might need to increase the number of bounces for your transparency. And again for transmission. So here I have transmission set to 4. If I set this to 0, I get no effect of this glass look whatsoever. If I set it to 1, I get this look. I'm not getting another light bounce that I need, I think. 2, still not good enough, so we set this to 4, and now it's starting to look like glass. Again, if you've got a very detailed glass material and you need more render on that, more light paths to be rendered, you can increase the transmission amount to, let's say, 8. Just a quick explanation of how the light paths work, but be aware that increasing these values will increase your render time, but will increase the quality of your render as well. So back to this, I'm not using transparent as well, so I can set this down to 4, and this is looking ready to render at this point. What I'll do now is press F12 to render this out, or I can just hit render image here, but F12 is the shortcut. And look at my render. This is 1K and this is rendering in about 20 seconds, I think, on this graphics card. So that took 19 seconds, and if we've got 60 frames at 19 seconds each, that runs at quite a big render time. So I'm going to quickly reduce this one more time. I'm going to back to my render settings. I'm going to look at my render settings here and change this noise threshold to 0.02 and bring this max samples down to about 400. If I press F12 now, this should render in a quicker time. So use these settings to get the best quality to time ratio that you need for your material. And then I can quickly show you how we can do some compositing with this as well. If I go into the compositing workspace in the top here, so I click compositing, and then turn on this icon here, this checkbox use nodes. And we now have our render in a render layer here, and we can add some nodes into this composite here. First thing I'm going to do is give some space between these guys, press Shift and A and search for a viewer, and just put your image into your viewer. And I see in the background my image. To zoom in, press V, zoom out, press V, and to zoom in, press Alt and V. V, Alt, V, to just get some zoom on that. Right. The thing we can add first is Shift and A. I'm going to search for a curves, not a time curve. Shift, search for curves, and get the RGB curves. I'm going to press Control and click to pick up both of these at the same time and drop them in the image output of curves, and then just connect image to image. So now my image is going to feed into my curves, and then this is what we're going to look at. If I just give a bit of a curve to this line here, I can just add a bit more contrast into the image. I'm going to set it to film-like, and I'm going to look at the red. So if I press R, I can specifically look at red. If I drag this down, I could take some of the red out of this image and make it feel a bit bluer. Or I could click on blue and I could add a bit of blue into this or take it away. Depends what you want. There's a lot other things we can do. For example, if I press Shift and A and I search for a glare, yeah, and I drop that in between, we can add this kind of glare effect on the light. So I'm just going to zoom in and tweak this a little bit. Maybe set this to 2. Set this to streaks. Ghost. Yeah, we can get a bit of glow happening here. You know, experiment with some of these settings and see where you can get. But the point is we can add a little bit of an effect in here, and this will be applied directly onto our render. So I quickly change this to fog glow, and this has got a nice like little glow effect around it now. The last thing we want to do is set our output folder. So if you go to output properties, go to output, click here. I'm going to choose an output folder, and I'm just going to call this output. Select that, and then we can go and render this animation. So our frame rate is set from 1 to 60. That's good. If we go back to our layout up here, we can view our current frame. And yep, we're good to go. We've checked our settings. I'm going to click render, render animation, and let this render out from frame 1 to frame 60. Okay, so this is now rendered out. I've got all my frames. If I look in this folder, all my frames are here from 1 to 60. Everything is rendered in my output folder. To combine this now into a video and to be able to edit multiple videos and things together, we can go to the video editing space. So if I click the plus here in the workspace right in the top, click plus, choose video editing and choose video editing again. And you will go into this workspace right here. I don't need this folder browser. I can just join these areas here. And I'm going to go to image. No, I'm going to go to add. And then I'm going to go to image sequence and then go to my output folder and go from 1 all the way to 60 and press A to select all and then click add image strip. And make sure this is going from 1 to 60 and not 60 to 1 because the order will affect the frames. And go from 1 to 60 and click add image strip. Now, if we click play, our video is going to play back to us. If for some reason this is set in a weird position, move this down. Yeah. I can drag these around. I can add multiple strips, different channels, audio channels and everything. But here, if I go and press play, my animation is going to run. And this is now my animated material. If I want to save this video now, I'm just going to go and look in my output properties here. And what we had set before was the file format to PNG. So we're rendering a PNG image sequence into this folder here. And what I'll change this to now is to FFmpeg, for example, for a video format. If I go to render, click render animation, Blender's just run through and combined all those frames. And if I look in my output folder from before, I should have, I have an MKV file here, which is a video file. And if I press click this, my video file is now playing. There we go. And now we have this saved as video. So that's how you set up an animation, how you render it as an image sequence, how you combine those image sequences in Blender, and how to keyframe and work with the basic animation tools inside of Blender. I hope that was useful for both learning a little bit about animation and a little bit about texturing as well as the render settings involved. So good luck, and I'm interested to see what you guys can create with this. I just wanted to add one point to this to make this actually loop and work a bit smoother. Because right now, if I watch this, it's just going to kind of glitch back from start to finish if I set my frame range correctly. So this kind of just then jumps back. What I could do is go to the end of this animation, go to image, go to add image sequence. And instead of going from 1 to 60, if I invert this and go from 60 at the top, so I set name to 60, then I press A to select everything and add image strip. We've done this backwards now, so this will now play back to the beginning again. So if I set the frame range up here from 1 to 60, I set it to 120 instead, so double the frames, and I press play now, this will go forward and back in a seamless loop from one point to the next in this material. So this is how you could loop this back and forth again. I just wanted to add that in, and if you guys check as well, look at your frame rate here. This will be important if you're working with animation, but set this to either 24 or 30, depending what you're working with. But here is how you can loop this animation into a continuous video. Hope that helps.